In the darkness before dawn on June 6, 1944, the skies above Normandy filled with an eerie sight. Hundreds of parachutes blossomed against the night sky, carrying what appeared to be Allied paratroopers deep into enemy territory. German sentries scrambled to their posts, officers barked orders, and entire units mobilized to confront what seemed to be a massive airborne invasion. But something was wrong. These paratroopers were eerily silent. They didn't return fire. And when the Germans finally reached them, they discovered a deception so audacious, so brilliantly conceived, that it would go down as one of the most successful ruses in military history. The figures descending from the sky weren't soldiers at all. They were dolls, crude cloth dummies stuffed with sand and straw, each barely 3 feet tall. The British called them Ruperts. The Americans called them Oscars. And on that fateful night, these lifeless decoys would tie up thousands of German troops, divert critical reinforcements, and help ensure the success of the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. But the story of these dummy paratroopers begins years earlier in the mind of a man whose ideas were initially dismissed as absurd, impractical, and a waste of valuable resources. This is the story of how military deception evolved from a controversial concept to a decisive weapon of war. This is the story of Operation Titanic. The year was 1938, and the world stood on the brink of catastrophe. In a small workshop in Ashland, Massachusetts, 2 brothers named George and Fred Friedman received an unusual visit. A British Trade Commission agent approached them with a secret contract, asking them to produce something that had never been made before. A dummy paratrooper, a decoy so convincing that it could fool an enemy army into believing an airborne invasion was underway. The concept was revolutionary. Since the First World War, military planners had wrestled with a fundamental problem. How do you protect your real forces while conducting operations? How do you make the enemy commit their troops to the wrong place at the wrong time? The answer, some believed, lay in deception. But creating effective military deceptions required more than just clever ideas. It required artists, engineers, and most importantly, believers who could convince skeptical commanders that fakery could win real battles. The Friedman brothers were fascinated by the challenge. They designed, tested, and produced a dummy they named Rupert. It was simple in concept, but ingenious in execution. The dummy had to be light enough to drop from an aircraft, realistic enough to fool observers on the ground, and disposable enough to be produced by the thousands. But when they presented their prototype, many military officials scoffed. Why waste resources on toys when real soldiers were needed? Why invest in elaborate hoaxes when honest firepower could win the day? The skepticism wasn't entirely unfounded. Military deception had a mixed history. For centuries, armies had used camouflage and misdirection with varying degrees of success. But the scale and sophistication of what the Friedmans proposed was unprecedented. They weren't suggesting a few hidden soldiers or a camouflaged artillery piece. They were proposing an entire phantom army that existed only in the imagination of the enemy. The British, however, were more receptive to unconventional ideas. They had learned harsh lessons in the trenches of the First World War, where a French painter named Lucien Victor Guirand d'Esquevala had pioneered military camouflage. D'Esquevala had created fake trees that served as observation posts, allowing Allied spotters to watch German positions from hollow steel replicas that replaced real trees under cover of darkness. 15 of his camouflage specialists perished installing these deceptions, but the intelligence they provided proved invaluable. One of the most audacious deceptions from that earlier war involved a fake horse carcass. French snipers would hollow out a papier-mâché replica of a deceased horse and hide inside it, complete with a telephone wire running back to their own trenches. For 3 days, the sniper remained concealed within the artificial Carcass, reporting enemy movements until the Germans finally spotted him climbing out. The Germans destroyed the fake horse immediately, but the concept had proven itself. Deception could work. These early experiments taught military planners a crucial lesson. The human mind is conditioned to see what it expects to see. A tree in a forest attracts no attention, even if that tree is actually a steel observation post. A deceased animal on a battlefield goes unnoticed, even if it contains a living soldier. And a parachute descending from the sky must surely carry a soldier, even if it's only carrying a sack of sand. By 1942, the Friedman brothers had refined their design. George Friedman introduced an inflatable version called the White Knight. The United States Navy was sufficiently impressed to order 5,000 units. By March 1944, these dummy paratroopers were ready for deployment, but the question remained, how would they be used? And more importantly, would they work? The answer came from the planners of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe. The invasion would require overwhelming force concentrated at the beaches of Normandy, but the Germans had fortified the entire French coast. If the Allies could make the Germans believe the invasion was happening in multiple locations simultaneously, they could divide the enemy's response and reduce resistance at the actual landing sites. A comprehensive deception plan called Operation Bodyguard was developed. It included fake radio traffic, dummy equipment, even an entire phantom army supposedly commanded by General George Patton and stationed near Dover, suggesting an invasion at Calais. But the planners wanted something more immediate, more visceral. They wanted the Germans to see with their own eyes an invasion that wasn't really happening. They wanted paradummies. 4 operations were planned under the code name Titanic. Each would involve dropping dummy paratroopers, along with small teams of actual Special Air Service commandos, in locations far from the real landing zones. The goal was simple but ambitious. Create enough confusion that German commanders would commit their reserves to fighting phantom armies while the real invasion unfolded elsewhere. The Ruperts themselves were crude but effective. Made from burlap and filled with sand or straw, they stood barely 3 feet tall. Each dummy was equipped with a small explosive charge designed to ignite on impact, burning away the cloth to prevent the Germans from immediately discovering the deception. The burning would also create the impression that the paratroopers had destroyed their parachutes to avoid detection, a standard procedure for airborne troops. But the Ruperts didn't operate alone. Each drop included devices called pintails, noisemakers that simulated rifle fire. Some drops included recordings of battle sounds, amplified to suggest large formations of troops, and most critically, small teams of actual SAS soldiers jumped with the dummies, conducting brief but intense attacks to reinforce the illusion of a major airborne operation. The planning for Operation Titanic was meticulous. RAF squadrons flying Halifaxes, Sterlings, and Hudsons would carry the dummies and the SAS teams. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the Germans might discover the deception before the actual invasion began. Too late, and the ruse would fail to divert enemy forces when they were needed most. Lieutenant Norman Poole was among the SAS commandos selected for Operation Titanic. He and his men understood the mission's significance and its dangers. They would be dropped deep in enemy territory with minimal support, tasked with creating maximum disruption. Their job was to be seen and heard, to make noise, to attack targets of opportunity, and then to disappear before the Germans could organize an effective response. Most importantly, they were instructed to allow some German soldiers to escape so they could spread reports of the airborne landings. The operation was approved, but not without controversy. Some commanders argued that real soldiers should not be risked on what amounted to an elaborate magic trick. The SAS teams might be captured or lost behind enemy lines with no hope of rescue. The resources devoted to dropping cloth dolls could instead be used to drop actual paratroopers who could accomplish real objectives. The debate raged in planning rooms and military headquarters with passionate advocates on both sides. But the advocates for deception had powerful evidence on their side. They pointed to earlier operations where small-scale deceptions had achieved disproportionate results. During the North Africa campaign, British forces had used inflatable tanks, fake artillery, and dummy supply depots to mislead German commanders about Allied strength and intentions. At El Alamein, entire phantom divisions had been created using nothing but canvas, wood, and clever positioning. These deceptions had contributed to decisive Allied victories. The para-dummy advocates also had a psychological argument. War, they insisted, was as much about perception as reality. If the Germans believed they faced multiple airborne divisions, they would respond as if those divisions existed. Troops diverted to fight phantom paratroopers couldn't defend the actual beaches. Reserves committed to one sector couldn't reinforce another. In the chaos of battle, uncertainty could be as powerful as actual firepower. As D-Day approached, 400 Ruperts were prepared for deployment. 4 separate drops were planned across Normandy. Operation Titanic I would simulate an airborne division landing north of the Seine River between Dieppe and Le Havre, designed to draw German reserves away from the actual landing areas. 200 dummies would be dropped along with 2 SAS teams who would cut communications and conduct raids. Operation Titanic II involved 50 dummies and noisemakers intended to delay German reserves from moving toward the beaches. Operation Titanic III, also using 50 dummies, aimed to draw German counterattack forces southwest of Caen. The largest commitment was Operation Titanic IV, which would drop 200 dummies near Saint-Lô, supplemented by 2 SAS teams carrying recording devices that played loud battle sounds. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, 40 aircraft took off from British airfields, their bellies loaded with cloth soldiers and the few flesh-and-blood commandos who would bring them to life. As the planes crossed the English Channel, the crews knew they were part of something unprecedented. Never before had military deception been attempted on such a scale. Never before had dummy soldiers been expected to tie up real enemy divisions. The drops began at 2 in the morning. In the darkness, the Ruperts tumbled from their aircraft, their parachutes blossoming as they descended toward French soil. The small explosive charges began detonating on impact, creating flashes of light and small fires. The pintails crackled with simulated gunfire, and the SAS commandos, landing among the dummies, immediately began their attacks. German observation posts spotted the parachutes immediately. Reports flooded into command centers across Normandy, paratroopers landing near Dieppe, airborne forces east of Caen, major drops around Coutances, Valognes, and Saint-Lô. To the German commanders, it appeared that the Allies were attempting simultaneous airborne operations across a massive front, potentially cutting off coastal defenders and isolating key positions before ground forces even arrived. The German response was immediate and exactly what the Allied planners had hoped for. Units were mobilized, reserves were committed. The 12th SS Panzer Division, one of Germany's most formidable armored formations, was ordered to deal with what was believed to be a major parachute landing near Lisieux. More than half the division moved to confront the threat, a threat that existed only in the form of 3-foot-tall cloth dolls and a handful of British commandos. The 9th and 15th Grenadier Regiment, the only reserve element of the 352nd Infantry Division defending one of the actual invasion beaches, spent the morning of June 6th searching woods for paratroopers that didn't exist. While they hunted phantoms, real Allied forces were struggling ashore at what would become known as Omaha Beach, where every German soldier made a critical difference. For the SAS teams on the ground, the operation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Lieutenant Poole and his commandos conducted hit-and-run attacks, fired weapons, played their recordings of battle noise, and then melted back into the darkness. They allowed carefully selected German soldiers to escape, ensuring that reports of the airborne landings would spread throughout the German command structure. But Operation Titanic was not without cost. 2 RAF aircraft were shot down during the dummy drops, their crews lost. Of the SAS soldiers who participated, many became separated in the scattered drops. Some evaded capture for weeks, conducting guerrilla operations behind enemy lines. Others were less fortunate. Lieutenant Poole and 4 American prisoners of war he had rescued were eventually cornered in a barn by a German patrol. Surrounded and outnumbered, facing capture by SS troops who were known for executing commandos rather than taking them prisoner, Poole made a desperate gambit. Fluent in German, he convinced his interrogator that he and his men were regular infantrymen, not special forces. His eloquence and quick thinking saved lives. He and another commando survived, though they endured further ordeals, including being bombed by Allied aircraft while imprisoned on a transport train. In the end, only 3 SAS members who participated in Operation Titanic returned safely to Allied lines immediately after the operation. 11 were captured or lost behind enemy lines. Some would eventually make their way back. Others would not survive the war. These men had volunteered for an operation that many had dismissed as foolish, risking their lives to make the enemy believe in an invasion that existed only in imagination. But their sacrifice was not in vain. German military records captured after the war revealed the extent of Operation Titanic's success. Commanders had reported major airborne landings across Normandy. Troops had been diverted from critical positions. Reserves had been committed to fighting an enemy that largely didn't exist. In the crucial hours when the real invasion was establishing its foothold on French beaches, German forces were scattered, confused, and responding to threats both real and imagined. One German commander reported that his forces had been cut off by a major parachute landing well north of the actual invasion beaches. Another ordered a massive search operation for paratroopers in areas miles from any real Allied airborne operation. The confusion was exactly what the Allied planners had intended, and it may have saved hundreds or even thousands of lives among the soldiers assaulting the beaches. The success of Operation Titanic vindicated the paradummy concept. The Friedman brothers' controversial invention had proven its worth in the most demanding test possible: real combat. The crude cloth dolls, each costing a fraction of what it cost to train and equip a real paratrooper, had accomplished strategic objectives that might have required entire divisions to achieve through conventional means. But the story of the paradummies didn't end on D-Day. The concept would be refined and used throughout the remainder of the war. For Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France in August 1944, 600 Ruperts were dropped to create confusion about landing locations. The dummies continued to tie up German troops and create the uncertainty that gave Allied forces crucial advantages. The paradummies also influenced post-war military thinking about deception operations. The United States Army continued developing the technology, creating more sophisticated versions that could be dropped during daylight hours. By the 1950s and 60s, paradummies had become standard equipment in the arsenals of multiple nations. The technology pioneered by the Friedman brothers and proven by brave SAS commandos had become an accepted tool of modern warfare. The lessons of Operation Titanic extended beyond the immediate tactical success. Military planners realized that in the age of aerial observation and rapid communications, deception could be as important as firepower. The human tendency to see what we expect to see, to interpret ambiguous information as confirming our assumptions, could be exploited to achieve strategic advantages. A phantom threat could be as effective as a real one if the enemy believed in it and responded accordingly. The artists and designers who created military camouflage and deception devices during the Second World War came from unlikely backgrounds. Painters, sculptors, stage magicians, and special effects artists found themselves applying their creative skills to the deadly serious business of war. They understood illusion, perspective, and human perception in ways that traditional military officers did not. They knew how to make the unreal appear real and the real appear unreal. One of these artists, a stage magician named Jasper Maskelyne, worked extensively on deception operations in North Africa. He created dummy tanks, fake artillery positions, and even an entire dummy railhead complete with fake supplies, fake vehicles, and fake soldiers. He later wrote that much of their work was designed to save lives rather than take them. Every enemy bullet that hit a dummy was one less bullet available to harm actual soldiers. This philosophy animated much of the deception work during the war. Yes, the ultimate goal was defeating the enemy. But if that goal could be achieved through trickery rather than firepower, through confusion rather than confrontation, then perhaps something valuable had been accomplished. The paradummies of Operation Titanic embody this philosophy, cloth and sand standing in for flesh and blood, diverting death away from the living. The technology of warfare has advanced dramatically since 1944. Modern militaries use electronic warfare, cyber operations, and sophisticated information campaigns to deceive their adversaries. But the fundamental principles demonstrated by Operation Titanic remain valid. Make the enemy see what you want them to see. Make them respond to threats that serve your purposes rather than theirs. Use their expectations and fears against them. Create uncertainty when you need freedom of action. And never underestimate the power of a well-executed deception. The Ruperts that fell from the sky over Normandy were not sophisticated devices. They were burlap sacks filled with sand, given rudimentary human form and equipped with simple parachutes. But they were deployed as part of a comprehensive plan that understood how military forces think and respond. They exploited the reality that in the fog of war, with incomplete information and high stakes, commanders must make decisions based on their best assessment of the situation. And if that assessment can be manipulated, the course of battle can be altered. The civilian populations in the areas where Ruperts landed faced their own challenges with the dummies. The explosive charges meant to destroy the evidence sometimes failed to detonate. Farmers and townspeople would discover these strange cloth figures in their fields and yards. They were warned not to approach them, as unexploded charges could still ignite. The silk parachutes used by real paratroopers were valuable in a time of wartime rationing, but the parachutes attached to Ruperts were less desirable because of the danger from unexploded charges. Few of these paradummies survived the war. Most were destroyed by their own charges, disposed of by military forces during cleanup operations, or deteriorated naturally. Today, only a handful exist in museums, preserved as examples of an unusual but effective military technology. They stand as small, almost comical reminders of a deadly serious operation that helped ensure the success of the largest invasion in history. The men who flew the aircraft that carried the Ruperts faced their own dangers. Anti-aircraft fire filled the night sky over Normandy. German fighters prowled the darkness looking for targets. The crews of the 2 aircraft shot down during Operation Titanic paid the ultimate price for an operation that many had initially dismissed as a waste of resources. Their sacrifice underscored the reality that even deception operations carried real risks and real costs. For the German soldiers who responded to the paradummy drops, the experience was confusing and frustrating. They mobilized in the middle of the night, rushed to positions, prepared for combat, and then found only small cloth figures and scattered evidence of what might have been a larger force. Some quickly realized they had been deceived. Others remained convinced for hours or even days that major airborne forces were operating in their sectors. The uncertainty itself was damaging, preventing effective coordination and response. German intelligence officers analyzing the invasion aftermath struggled to understand the full scope of Allied deception operations. They knew they had been fooled, but determining exactly how and to what extent proved difficult. The para-dummy drops were just one component of a massive deception plan that included fake radio traffic, dummy equipment visible to aerial reconnaissance, and carefully planned misinformation fed through captured agents. Separating truth from fiction became nearly impossible. The success of Operation Titanic contributed to a broader understanding that modern warfare required more than military force. It required intelligence, counterintelligence, deception, psychological operations, and a sophisticated understanding of how information flows and how decisions are made. The Second World War was perhaps the first conflict where these elements were systematically integrated into overall strategy rather than treated as side activities or afterthoughts. In the decades since D-Day, military historians have debated the precise impact of various deception operations. How many German troops were actually diverted by the para-dummies? How long did the confusion last? Would the invasion have succeeded without these elaborate ruses? The answers are difficult to determine with precision, as the chaos of battle makes it hard to isolate the effects of any single factor. What is clear is that the German response to D-Day was slower and less coordinated than it might have been. Critical hours passed while commanders tried to determine where the real threat existed and where they should commit their reserves. In those hours, Allied forces established themselves on French soil, creating a foothold that would eventually become an unbreakable position. The para-dummies didn't win the battle alone, but they contributed to creating the conditions for victory. The story of Operation Titanic also highlights the importance of innovation in warfare. The military establishment initially resisted the para-dummy concept. It seemed too unconventional, too reliant on trickery rather than strength. But individuals who believed in the idea persisted, refining the technology, proving its worth in tests, and ultimately convincing commanders to include it in the invasion plan. Innovation often requires advocates who can overcome institutional skepticism and conventional thinking. The para-dummies also represented a different kind of military technology. They weren't designed to destroy the enemy. They weren't weapons in the traditional sense. They were tools of manipulation, designed to influence enemy decision-making rather than inflict casualties. In this way, they pointed toward future developments in warfare, where information, perception, and cognitive effects would become increasingly important alongside traditional kinetic capabilities. For the families of the SAS soldiers who participated in Operation Titanic, the operation's secrecy meant they couldn't know for years what their loved ones had accomplished. Many of these operations remained classified for decades after the war. The families knew only that their sons, brothers, and fathers had parachuted into Normandy, and that some had not returned. The full story of their sacrifice and the strategic importance of their mission remained hidden. Lieutenant Norman Poole, who survived capture and interrogation through his quick thinking and language skills, later provided detailed accounts of the operation. His testimony helped historians understand what the SAS teams experienced on the ground and how they managed to create the impression of a much larger force. His ordeal, including being bombed by Allied aircraft while imprisoned on a train, illustrated the complex and dangerous nature of operations behind enemy lines. The evolution of military deception from the fake trees and horse carcasses of World War I to the sophisticated operations of World War II demonstrated how quickly military art could advance when necessity demanded innovation. What began as small-scale efforts by individual commanders became coordinated campaigns involving thousands of personnel and vast resources. The para-dummies were just one element of this evolution, but they represented a creative approach to a fundamental military problem. In the modern era, where surveillance satellites, drone reconnaissance, and electronic intelligence provide unprecedented visibility of the battlefield, some might think deception has become obsolete. But military forces worldwide continue to invest in deception capabilities, recognizing that even with advanced sensors and communications, uncertainty and confusion remain powerful tools. The principles demonstrated by Operation Titanic, that perception can be as important as reality, that causing the enemy to make mistakes is as valuable as preventing your own, remain relevant. The story of the banned fake cow Carcass, blind dropping 12 paratroopers, has become something of a legend, mixing elements of various World War II deception operations into a single compelling narrative. While the specific details may be embellished or conflated, the underlying truth remains. Military forces during the Second World War used incredibly creative and often controversial methods to deceive their enemies. Fake observation posts, dummy paratroopers, inflatable tanks, phantom armies, all played roles in the greatest conflict in human history. These deceptions succeeded because they understood fundamental aspects of human psychology and military decision-making. They exploited the reality that in combat, information is always incomplete, time is always pressing, and commanders must act on their best assessment even when uncertainty remains. By manipulating that assessment, by creating false certainty, or increasing uncertainty at critical moments, deception operations could achieve effects far beyond what their modest resources might suggest. The legacy of Operation Titanic and similar operations extends to the present day. Military forces train specialists in deception operations. Intelligence agencies study how to mislead adversaries. Even in an age of artificial intelligence and quantum computing, the human element in warfare remains susceptible to well-crafted deceptions. The Ruperts that fell from the sky over Normandy were primitive by modern standards, but the principles they represented remained sophisticated and relevant. As the sun rose over Normandy on June 6, 1944, German soldiers searching for paratroopers found burned cloth, expended parachutes, and evidence of small unit actions. Some realized they had been deceived. Others remained uncertain about what they had encountered. But across the region, German forces had been diverted, delayed, and confused. And on the beaches, Allied soldiers were fighting their way inland, beginning the liberation of Europe. The paradummies had done their job. The band idea had proven its worth. And the volunteers who risked everything to make cloth dolls seem like real soldiers had contributed to one of history's most important military victories. Their story deserves to be remembered not just for the cleverness of the deception, but for the courage required to execute it and the strategic vision necessary to approve it. In the end, Operation Titanic demonstrated that warfare is not just about superior firepower or greater numbers. It's about using every available means, including creativity, psychology, and deception, to achieve objectives. The humble Rupert, a 3-foot-tall cloth doll, became an unlikely but effective tool in the arsenal of freedom, and the men who jumped alongside these dummies, knowing they were volunteering for one of the most unusual and dangerous missions of the war, exemplified the courage and innovation that ultimately defeated tyranny. The final assessment of Operation Titanic comes from German military records themselves. They confirm that forces were diverted, time was lost, and confusion reigned at critical moments. They validate the Allied planning and the risks taken by SAS commandos. They prove that sometimes the greatest victories come not from overwhelming force, but from clever application of limited resources in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And they ensure that the story of the paradummies, the Ruperts, and Oscars who never fired a shot but still contributed to winning the war will be remembered as one of the most creative and effective military operations ever conceived.